3,000 Japanese soldiers attacked a Marine position on the night of October 1942. The position was held by fewer than 300 Americans, 10-1. The attack had been planned with precision, 3 waves, under cover of darkness. The mathematics were simple. Overwhelming force against a thin line. The position would fall before sunrise. The first wave hit the wire at 10 p.m. By 2 a.m., the mathematics had stopped working. The Marines had called artillery fire on their own position, shells landing within meters of their own wire. A decision that requires a very specific kind of mind, the kind that calculates under assault that the risk of being killed by your own artillery is lower than the risk of being overrun, and then makes that call calmly. The third wave hesitated. In the language of the Imperial Japanese Army, hesitation was an almost unimaginable admission. The third wave came. It also broke. By dawn, over 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The Marine line held. 300 men against 3,000. Tarawa, 4,600 Japanese defenders. 17 survived. Not 17%, 17 men. Iwo Jima, 26,000 Marine casualties. 36 days. They took the island. Centron, France, 200 German soldiers. 10 trucks, heavy weapons, held off by 3 Marines. The arithmetic never added up. That was the problem. Every German officer who studied these numbers wrote some version of the same conclusion. We have the data. We have no framework. This is the story behind the numbers, not told by the Marines, told by the men who could not make the numbers work. And to understand why the numbers broke, you need to understand what the men doing the counting expected. By the autumn of 1942, the German Wehrmacht had been at war for 3 years, and in those 3 years it had done something no army in modern history had accomplished. It had built a record of conquest so total, so systematic, so precise, that its officers had begun to believe they understood war the way a physicist understands gravity, not as an opinion, as a law. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Not because the Poles were weak. The Poles fought, but the Wehrmacht moved faster than the Poles could think. Armored columns driving 60 kilometers a day through gaps that Polish commanders did not know existed until German tanks were behind them. 5 weeks. A country erased from the map while its allies were still debating whether to respond. France fell in 6, and France was not Poland. France had the largest army in Western Europe. It had the Maginot Line. It had the British Expeditionary Force fighting alongside it. None of it mattered. The Wehrmacht came through the Ardennes, a forest that French generals had declared impassable for armor, and they came so fast that by the time the French High Command understood what was happening, German panzers were already closer to Paris than most of the French army was. Dunkirk. The British pushed into the sea. 300,000 men rescued from the beaches in a flotilla of fishing boats and pleasure craft, and the British called it a miracle, which it was. But the Germans looked at Dunkirk and saw something simpler. They saw an enemy that had been beaten so completely that the sea was the only direction left to run. And then Russia, Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. 3 million German soldiers crossing the Soviet border in a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 800 kilometers into Soviet territory in a single summer. Entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners taken in single battles. Kiev, Smolensk, Vyazma. The names read like a catalogue of annihilation. By 1942, the Wehrmacht was not simply an experienced army. It was the most experienced fighting force on the planet, and that experience had given its officers something dangerous: certainty. They had fought the best armies in Europe, and they had beaten all of them. And from that experience they had built a taxonomy, a system of classification for enemy quality, as precise and clinical as a botanist categorizing species of plants. The British were disciplined but reactive, excellent in defense, predictable in offense. Their officers followed doctrine with a rigidity that made them reliable, but also made them readable. If you knew what the British manual said to do in a given situation, you knew what the British would do. This was both their strength and their limitation. The Australians were aggressive, more willing to improvise than the British. But they relied too heavily on individual initiative, which meant their attacks were fierce, but often poorly coordinated, dangerous in small actions, less dangerous in large ones. The Soviets were what the Germans called inexhaustible, a single word that concealed more fear than it admitted. The Soviets would take casualties that would destroy any Western army and continue fighting. They would lose an entire division and replace it with another division that was just as willing to die. The Germans respected the Soviets. They also feared them, but they understood them. The Soviet system produced soldiers who obeyed. It produced them in numbers that defied arithmetic. And it fed them into the line with a consistency that was terrifying precisely because it was mechanical. Every enemy had a category. Every category had a counter. This was how the Wehrmacht thought about war, not as chaos, as engineering. And then America entered the fight. The Americans arrived in North Africa in late 1942. Operation Torch, tens of thousands of young men who had been civilians 12 months earlier, wearing uniforms that still looked new, carrying equipment that was better than anything any other army in the war possessed. Their rifles were excellent. Their vehicles were abundant. Their supply chain was extraordinary. They had more of everything than anyone the Germans had ever fought. German intelligence officers assessed them quickly. The assessment was not contemptuous. That is important to understand. The Wehrmacht did not make the mistake of dismissing its enemies. It studied them. And what it saw in the Americans was a clear pattern. Well-equipped amateurs, men who had been trained adequately, supplied generously, and sent into a war they did not yet understand. Men who would perform competently under moderate pressure and break under extreme pressure. This was not a guess. It was a clinical evaluation based on observed behavior. And then Kasserine Pass confirmed it. February 1943, the mountains of western Tunisia, near Kasserine Pass. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most celebrated tactical commander in the German army, launched an offensive against American positions in the Atlas Mountains. What happened next was not a battle. It was an education. American units were overrun. Defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed in hours. Communication broke down. Commanders lost contact with their subordinates. Units retreated without orders. Some units retreated so fast they left their equipment behind. In 6 days, more than 6,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. Rommel's Afrika Korps had driven 50 miles through the American line. In Berlin, the intelligence analysts updated their files. The Americans fit the model. Well-equipped, well-supplied, brave enough in comfortable conditions. But when the pressure exceeded a certain threshold, the machine stopped working. The officers froze. The enlisted men looked for someone to tell them what to do. And when no one told them, they stopped fighting. Category confirmed. File closed. Except it was not closed. Because at the same time, those reports from North Africa were arriving in Berlin. Other reports were arriving through a completely different channel. Reports collected by German military attaches stationed in Tokyo. Reports forwarded through the routine intelligence exchanges that Germany and Japan maintained as allies. These reports came from the Pacific, from islands that barely appeared on German strategic maps, from engagements that no German general considered strategically significant, and they described something that did not fit any category the Wehrmacht possessed. To understand what those reports contained, you need to meet 3 men. The first was 25 years old, quiet and almost unnaturally calm. His name was John Basilone. He had been born in Buffalo, New York, in 1916, the 6th of 10 children in an Italian-American family. He had enlisted in the army before his 18th birthday, served 3 years in the Philippines, and then come home and done what most veterans did. He worked. He drove a truck. He lived in Raritan, New Jersey, and tried to be a civilian. But civilian life did not fit John Basilone the way the military had. Something about the structure, something about the clarity. In 1940, he re-enlisted. Not in the army this time, in the Marine Corps. By September of 1942, Sergeant Basilone was on Guadalcanal with the 1st Marine Division. He was a machine gunner. He was good at it. He was good at it the way some are good at mathematics, not through effort, but through a kind of native fluency that made the weapon feel like an extension of his own nervous system. He was quiet. He did not talk much about what he thought or what he felt. What the men around him noticed was something simpler. When the shooting started, Basilone got calmer. Not braver, calmer, as if the noise and the chaos and the proximity of death activated something in him that normal life did not reach. The second man was 5,000 miles away, in Tokyo, and he was 51 years old. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and he was a lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was tall for a Japanese officer, well-read, and unusually thoughtful. He had spent 2 years in the United States in the 1920s as a military attaché. He had traveled across the country. He had visited Detroit and watched the automobile factories. He had seen the scale of American industrial production firsthand, and it had changed him. Kuribayashi did not believe Japan could win a long war against the United States. He understood, in a way that many of his colleagues did not, that American power was not simply military. It was economic. It was industrial. It was a nation that could build more ships in a single year than Japan could build in a decade. He kept this opinion largely to himself, because in the Japan of 1942, expressing doubt about final victory was not a career-enhancing decision. In the autumn of 42, reports from Guadalcanal were circulating through the Imperial Japanese Army's intelligence channels. The Americans on those islands did not match the Americans that officers like Kuribayashi had known during peacetime postings. The Americans he had met in Washington and Detroit were friendly, open, generous, and soft. The Americans the reports described were something else entirely. Kuribayashi would not be assigned to his final command for another 2 years, but when that assignment came, when he was ordered to defend a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima, he would study every one of those reports, and he would build his defense around what they taught him. The third man was in London, and he was 30 years old, and he was not like anyone else in any branch of any military service in the entire Allied war effort. His name was Peter Ortiz. He had been born in New York City in 1913 to a French-Spanish father and an American mother. He had been educated at the University of Grenoble. He spoke 10 languages. He had joined the French Foreign Legion at 19, fought in North Africa, earned 2 Croix de Guerre, gone to Hollywood to advise on war films, re-enlisted in the Legion when the war began, received a battlefield commission in the Battle of France, been shot in the hip while blowing up a German fuel dump, been captured, spent 15 months as a prisoner of war, escaped after 5 attempts, made his way back to the United States, and enlisted in the Marine Corps in June of 1942 because the Army Air Corps was taking too long with his paperwork. At Paris Island, the Marine Corps training depot in South Carolina, Ortiz was an unusual recruit. He arrived wearing French military decorations. He had already completed parachute training in the Legion and had extensive jump experience. When the Marines sent him through their own jump school, he took it with good humor. He was one of the few men in the Allied military who had more experience jumping out of airplanes than teaching him how to do it. By late 1943, Captain Ortiz was one of only 80 Marine Corps officers assigned to the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later become the CIA. He was in London, preparing for a mission that would drop him behind enemy lines in occupied France. 3 men, 3 different wars, 3 expressions of the same institution, and the thread that connected them was not patriotism or courage or any of the words that monuments are made of. It was something more specific, something built into them at Parrot Island and San Diego before any of them ever heard a shot fired in anger. The Marine Corps in 1942 was not a mass army. This is the single most important fact about the Marines, and it is the fact that German and Japanese analysts consistently failed to grasp until it was too late. The United States Army in World War II was a mobilization machine. It took millions of civilian men, ran them through standardized training, and produced functional infantry at industrial scale. The system was designed for volume. It worked. It produced adequate soldiers by the hundreds of thousands. Some of those soldiers became extraordinary. Most became competent. And competence multiplied by American industrial output was enough to win. The Marine Corps was built on a different premise entirely. It was too small to win by volume. In 1942, the entire Marine Corps was smaller than some individual army divisions. It could not afford to produce adequate soldiers because it did not have enough men to absorb the losses that adequacy produces. So it did something else. Beginning in the 1920s, Marine Corps planners had looked at the map of the Pacific and seen their future. They knew, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, that the next war would require amphibious assaults against fortified island positions held by the Japanese. They knew this 20 years before it happened, and they spent those 20 years designing a training system that would produce men capable of surviving it. Not adequate men, not competent men. Men who could function and fight and make decisions in conditions that would shatter competent men like glass. The difference was not physical, although Marine training was physically brutal. The difference was psychological, and it came down to a single distinction that German analysts would later identify but never fully understand. Most armies train soldiers to follow orders under fire. This is the standard model. It works as long as the chain of command remains intact. An officer gives an order, a soldier executes it. The system functions because every man knows his role and performs it. Trained men to make decisions under fire. This seems like a small distinction. It is not. It is the difference between a machine that works when all its parts are connected and a machine that works when half its parts are missing. In the jungles of the Pacific, command structures broke down constantly. Officers were killed in the first minutes of an engagement. Radio equipment failed. Units lost contact with each other. The platoon, sometimes the fire team, sometimes a single man standing alone in the dark, became the fundamental unit of combat. In those conditions, an army trained to follow orders freezes. It waits for instructions that will never come. It looks for leadership that no longer exists, and in that frozen moment, it dies. An army trained to decide does not freeze. It looks at the 10 meters immediately in front of it, identifies what needs to happen, and does it, without orders, without permission, without waiting. The Germans had a word for this quality. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, the practice of giving a subordinate an objective and trusting him to find his own way to reach it. The Wehrmacht considered this a uniquely German military innovation. They were proud of it. They had used it to conquer Europe. They did not expect to find it on the other side. And then the reports from Guadalcanal started arriving. And in those reports, German analysts began reading descriptions of American junior officers and non-commissioned officers making tactical decisions independently, aggressively, in conditions of extreme confusion, without waiting for orders from above. One internal assessment, compiled from Japanese prisoner interrogations and shared through the Berlin intelligence apparatus, noted that American Marine infantry units displayed a willingness for close combat not observed in other Western forces. Their junior officers attacked. The assessment added 4 words that in the dry language of military intelligence were the equivalent of an alarm bell. This is not common. The Japanese had expected the Marines on Guadalcanal to behave like every other Western force that had ever operated at the end of a fragile supply line in hostile terrain. They expected them to secure the airfield, dig in, establish a perimeter, and wait for reinforcements. This was what rational military forces did when they were outnumbered and undersupplied on an island 6,000 miles from home. The 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. They secured Henderson Field in 2 days. The Japanese, who held numerical superiority in the surrounding jungle, prepared their counterattack. They had been fighting in jungle terrain for years. They knew this environment. They owned it. They waited for the Americans to dig in. The Americans did not dig in. They went into the jungle. They went into the jungle at night. in small patrols, moving through vegetation so thick that visibility dropped to zero, and they began hunting. Japanese sentries reported hearing nothing. No footsteps, no equipment rattling, no communication, just silence. And then, in the morning, men who had been alive at midnight were dead. Prisoner interrogations, compiled by the Allied translator and interpreter section. The intelligence unit responsible for processing captured Japanese documents and testimony, recorded a pattern of statements from Guadalcanal survivors that German attaches in Tokyo flagged for transmission to Berlin. The pattern was consistent. The prisoners described Americans who did not behave like Americans, who moved at night, who attacked when outnumbered, who did not seem to operate according to any model the Japanese possessed for understanding Western soldiers. One German analyst, reading the compiled reports, made a notation that would prove more prophetic than he could have known. The notation said that the observations did not correspond to existing German assessments of American infantry capability, and that additional verification through independent sources was required. He would spend the next 2 years looking for that verification. He would find it at Tarawa. He would find it at Iwo Jima. He would find it in a village in the French Alps, where 3 Marines held off 200 German soldiers, and every time he found it, it said the same thing. The model is wrong. These men do not fight according to any model we possess. The night of October 24th, 1942. Guadalcanal. The air was thick and wet, and smelled like rotting vegetation and cordite. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, a man whose Marines called him Chesty because of the way he carried himself, chest forward, chin up, as if daring the world to take a swing, had positioned his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, along a perimeter south of Henderson Field. The perimeter was thin. Puller had fewer than 300 men, holding a line that doctrine said required 3 times that number. He knew the Japanese were coming. Intelligence had been tracking the movement of Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama's forces through the jungle for days. Maruyama had approximately 3,000 soldiers. They had been marching through some of the worst terrain on the island, hacking through jungles so dense that entire companies had become separated from each other. They were exhausted. They were hungry. Some had not eaten in 2 days, but they were coming, and they outnumbered Puller's men 10 to 1. The plan was precise. 3 waves of Japanese infantry would advance under cover of darkness. They would hit the Marine perimeter simultaneously at multiple points. The weight of numbers would overwhelm the thin American line before supporting weapons could be brought to bear. By dawn, Henderson Field would be Japanese again. At approximately 2200 hours, the first wave emerged from the jungle. What happened in the next 4 hours is recorded in after-action reports filed by both sides. But the reports do not agree on what to call it. The Japanese reports describe a battle. The Marine reports describe a fight. The distinction matters. A battle implies strategy, maneuvering, the application of doctrine. A fight is something more primal, something closer to the bone. The first wave hit the wire, and the Marines opened fire, machine guns, rifles, grenades. The noise was so loud that men standing 10 feet apart could not hear each other shout. Muzzle flashes turned the darkness into a strobe of orange and white, illuminating frozen images. A Japanese soldier climbing over the wire, a Marine feeding a belt into a machine gun, a body falling, another body behind it, still moving forward. The first wave did not break through. It broke apart. The men who were not killed fell back into the jungle. The men who were killed hung on the wire like laundry on a line. The second wave came 20 minutes later. This time the Japanese shifted their point of attack, probing for a weak spot in the Marine line. They found one. On Puller's left flank, a section of the perimeter held by a machine gun squad was overwhelmed. Japanese soldiers poured through the gap, and here is where the mathematics began to fail. In any conventional military analysis, a breach in the line at 10 to 1 odds should produce a cascading collapse. The units on either side of the gap pull back to avoid being flanked. The pullback creates new gaps. The new gaps are exploited. The line dissolves. This is not theory. This is what happened to American units at Kasserine Pass 8 months earlier. This is what happened to British units in Malaya. This is what happened to Soviet units in the first weeks of Barbarossa. It did not happen here. Puller's Marines did not pull back. The units adjacent to the breach turned to face the penetration and kept firing. And somewhere in the chaos and the noise and the dark, a 25-year-old sergeant from New Jersey did something that would change the way the enemy thought about the United States Marine Corps. John Basilone was manning a heavy machine gun position in the sector where the Japanese had broken through. 2 guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. When the breach occurred, the gun to his left was overrun. Its crew was dead. Basilone moved through active fire to the disabled weapon, not crawled, moved upright. Through a space where bullets were cutting the air at chest height, he moved an extra gun into position, repaired another, and personally manned it. Then the ammunition ran critically low, and the supply lines were cut off. What Basilone did next is recorded in his Medal of Honor citation, an official document written in the restrained language that the military uses when it is describing acts that restrained language cannot adequately contain. The citation states that Sergeant Basilone, at great risk of his life, and in the face of continued enemy attack, battled his way through hostile lines with urgently needed shells for his gunners. It does not give the distance. The exact number does not matter. What matters is the space between where the ammunition was and where the guns were, and what occupied that space, which was a Japanese infantry assault in progress. Basilone made the run. He brought the ammunition back. He held his line until replacements arrived. His citation credits him with contributing in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. He did this for hours, not minutes. Hours. The second wave broke on the wire with the first still dying there. The third wave hesitated. That word, hesitated. In the language of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942, hesitation was an admission that bordered on heresy. The Japanese military culture of that era did not accommodate hesitation. It did not have a framework for it. An order was given. An attack was made. If the attack failed, another attack was made. The concept of pausing to reconsider was not part of the vocabulary. But the third wave hesitated, and then it came, and it too was broken. By dawn on October 25th, the Marine perimeter held. Maruyama's assault had failed. The Japanese had suffered catastrophic casualties. The exact numbers vary by source, but the most reliable estimates put Japanese dead at over 700 in a single night, against a Marine force 1/10 their size. Basilone received the Medal of Honor. He was sent back to the United States. He was given a warbond tour. He was asked to travel the country, shake hands, give speeches, sell bonds. He was famous. He was safe. The war for John Bass could have been over. He requested to go back, not to a desk, not to a training command, back to the line, back to the infantry, back to the place where the machine guns are. His request was granted. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division. He would land on a small volcanic island called Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. But that is later, and before we reach Iwo Jima, the arithmetic has to break 2 more times, once at Tarawa and once in the French Alps. The island of Betio sits at the southwestern corner of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands chain. It is roughly the size of the parking lot at a large American shopping mall. It is flat. It is narrow. In November of 1943, it was the most heavily fortified position per square meter in the Pacific Theater. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki had built his defense with the thoroughness of a man who did not intend to lose. Over 500 reinforced bunkers, pillboxes connected by underground tunnels, log and coral walls 8 feet thick, barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, over 100 machine gun positions, each with overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach into a killing zone. Shibazaki is widely reported to have told his staff that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. The original source of this quote is debated among historians. Whether he said exactly those words matters, less than the fact that the defenses he built made those words plausible. The 4,600 Japanese Marines and Korean laborers on BTO were dug in so deep and so well that no conventional bombardment could reach them. The American plan was straightforward. The Navy would bombard the island for 3 hours. The bombardment would destroy the Japanese defenses. The Marines would land on the beach, secure the island, and move on to the next objective. The first thing that went wrong was the bombardment. 3 hours of naval gunfire hit the island with thousands of shells. It looked devastating. It looked like nothing could survive it. Almost everything survived it. The shells exploded on the surface. The Japanese were underground. When the shelling stopped, they climbed back to their guns. The second thing that went wrong was the tide. The assault was planned for a high tide that would allow the landing craft to clear the reef that surrounded the island. The tide did not cooperate. Hundreds of landing craft, called Higgins boats, grounded on the reef 400 meters from the beach. 400 meters of open water, waist deep, chest deep in places, no cover, no concealment. And on the beach, every Japanese gun that the bombardment had failed to destroy was waiting. The Marines climbed out of the boats and began walking. They walked into machine gun fire that was so dense it churned the water white. Men fell in clusters. Some were hit before they had taken 10 steps. The water turned red. Equipment sank. Radios were destroyed. Officers were killed. Entire squads ceased to exist between the reef and the beach. In the first 2 hours of the landing at Tarawa, the Marines suffered casualties at a rate that has few parallels in American military history. Whole companies lost their commanding officers before reaching shore. Platoons arrived on the beach, with half their men already floating face down in the lagoon behind them. And here is where the arithmetic broke for the second time. Because the Marines who reached the beach kept going, not because they had orders. Most of the officers who could have given orders were dead, not because they had a plan. The plan had died with the tide tables, not because they knew what was happening on their left or their right. Communications were gone. Most of them did not know whether the men who had been next to them in the landing craft were alive or dead. They kept going because they had been trained to keep going. Because somewhere in the furnace of Paris Island or San Diego, in the months before the war found them, a drill instructor had taken the natural human instinct to stop when everything is falling apart, and had replaced it with a different instinct, an instinct to move, to advance, to find the next piece of cover, the next target, the next problem to solve, and solve it. Unit cohesion, the military term for the invisible force that holds a fighting unit together, is supposed to collapse under these conditions. When a unit loses its officers, its communications, and a third of its men in the first hour of combat, the textbook says it ceases to function as a military organization. It becomes a collection of frightened individuals. It becomes a mob. The Marines at Tarawa did not become a mob. Sergeants took over for dead lieutenants. Corporals took over for dead sergeants. Privates who had never led anything in their lives looked at the 2 or 3 men nearest them and said, "Follow me," and moved toward the guns. 76 hours, that is how long the battle lasted. 3 days and 4 hours from the first wave hitting the reef to the last Japanese position falling silent. 1,009 Marines were killed. 2,300 were wounded. Of the approximately 4,600 Japanese defenders, 17 survived. Not 17%, 17 individual human beings. Everyone else on that island died rather than surrender, and the Marines killed them, room by room, bunker by bunker, tunnel by tunnel, for 76 hours. German analysts received the Tarawa data through their intelligence channels. The reports they compiled were, by the standards of military intelligence writing, unusually detailed. They noted the casualty ratios. They noted the failure of the naval bombardment. They noted the tide miscalculation. They noted every factor that should have produced a military paralysis, a stalled assault, a force too damaged to continue its mission. And then they noted the outcome. The German assessment struggled with the same problem that Japanese commanders had struggled with. The losses should have stopped the attack. Every model the Germans possessed for predicting when an infantry force reaches its breaking point said that Tarawa should have broken the Marines. The casualties were too high. The confusion was too total. The circumstances were too catastrophic. Instead, the losses produced an acceleration. The Marines did not slow down as the casualties mounted. They sped up, they attacked harder. They moved faster, as if the deaths of the men around them did not produce paralysis, but produced its opposite, a cold, focused, forward momentum that no model could predict and no defense could stop. One German assessment described Tarawa as the most concentrated example of offensive spirit under adverse conditions encountered in any theater of the war. But the word that mattered most in that sentence was not offensive or spirit, it was adverse. Because the conclusion the Germans were being forced toward, the conclusion they resisted because it violated everything they believed about how armies function, was that the Marines performed better when conditions got worse. That difficulty did not degrade their capability, it sharpened it. Every fighting force the Germans had ever studied degraded under pressure. The Marines sharpened. The worse the situation became, the more dangerous they grew. It was as if hardship was not a tax on their capability, but a fuel for it. And while the analysts in Berlin were still turning the Tarawa data over in their hands, looking for the error in their calculations, a Marine captain in London was preparing to give them something even harder to explain. Not on an island in the Pacific, in their own backyard. In all of World War II, the United States Marine Corps sent the overwhelming majority of its men to the Pacific. The Marines were built for island warfare, and the Pacific was where the islands were. The European theater was the Army's war. That was the division. That was the agreement. But there were exceptions. 80 Marine Corps officers, out of hundreds of thousands who served, were assigned to the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was the Wartime Intelligence Agency, the predecessor to the CIA. Its mission was espionage, sabotage, and the support of resistance movements behind enemy lines. It recruited from every branch of the military, and among the 80 Marines it took, one stood out in a way that made the others look ordinary. Peter Ortiz arrived in London in the summer of 1943 with a service record that read like a novel that no publisher would accept because the plot was too improbable. 5 years in the French Foreign Legion, 2 Croix de Guerre, earned fighting in the deserts of North Africa, a battlefield commission in the Battle of France, a bullet wound in the hip received while destroying a German fuel depot, 15 months as a prisoner of war, 5 escape attempts, success on the 5th, a journey across occupied Europe back to the United States, enlistment in the Marine Corps because the Army Air Corps was too slow with paperwork. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall. He spoke 10 languages. He had worked in Hollywood advising on war films. He looked, according to everyone who met him, like a movie star who had accidentally wandered into the wrong profession and then discovered he was better at the real thing than anyone else in the room. On the night of January 6, 1944, Captain Peter Ortiz jumped out of a Royal Air Force bomber over the Haute Savoie region of the French Alps. He jumped with a British colonel named Thackwait and a French radio operator known only as Monnier. The 3 men floated down through the winter darkness into occupied France. Their mission was called Operation Union. Its objective was to assess the fighting capability of the Maquis, the French resistance fighters operating in the Savoie, Isère, and Drôme regions. The 3 men were to make contact with the resistance, evaluate their readiness to fight, and report back to London. What Ortiz did instead was something his superiors had not quite anticipated, and his enemies would not soon forget. He and his team linked up with the resistance and began organizing them into fighting units. They arranged airdrops of weapons and supplies. They conducted sabotage operations against German positions. They stole vehicles from the Gestapo. They rescued 4 downed RF pilots and evacuated them to neutral Spain. All of this was within the scope of the team, more or less. What was not within any reasonable scope was what Ortiz did in a bar. The details of this incident exist in multiple accounts that do not entirely agree with each other. The Museum of the Marine Corps tells one version. Peter Ortiz himself told another in post-war interviews. His British colleague recorded a third. What follows is what the sources agree on. Where they diverge, the divergence is noted. Officers from the German 157th Division were in a bar in a town somewhere in the Haute-Savoie. The specific town has never been identified with certainty. These officers had been hunting the American Marine and his resistance contacts for weeks. They were drinking and talking, and at some point the conversation turned to the tall American, who was causing them so much trouble. They began cursing him. They cursed the Marine Corps. They cursed President Franklin Roosevelt. They cursed the Allies. Peter Ortiz was sitting nearby, dressed in civilian clothes. He listened for a while, then he stood up, left the bar, and walked back to his safe house. At the safe house, he changed clothes. He put on his United States Marine Corps uniform, complete with every decoration he had earned. American medals, French medals. He strapped on 2 Colt Model 1911 pistols, the standard 0.45 caliber sidearm of the American military. He pulled a raincoat over the uniform, and he walked back to the bar. He approached the German officers. He ordered drinks for them, and then he removed the raincoat. Underneath was the uniform of a United States Marine captain standing in a bar in occupied France, 400 miles behind the nearest Allied line, with 2 0.45 caliber pistols drawn and pointed at a table of German officers who had been cursing his name 5 minutes earlier. He said, according to the most commonly cited account, a toast to the President of the United States. The Germans drank. He said, a toast to the Marine Corps. The Germans drank again. What happened next is where the sources diverge. The Museum of the Marine Corps states that Ortiz drew his pistols and shot the officers. Ortiz himself, in later interviews, said he let them live. His reasoning, as he explained it, was that dead officers tell no stories. Living officers would spread the story of what had happened, and the story, spreading through the German ranks and the French countryside, would do more for the morale of the resistance than a few quiet deaths into a provincial bar. What is not disputed by any source is the central fact. A United States Marine officer walked into a bar full of enemy soldiers in occupied territory, revealed his identity and his uniform, and walked out alive. Operation Union 1 was terminated in May of 1944. Ortiz was extracted from France and flown to London. He received his first Navy Cross for valor in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. He was promoted to major, and then he went back. Operation Union 2 began on August 1, 1944. Major Peter Ortiz into for the second time, this time leading a team of 8. 5 Marines: Gunnery Sergeant Robert LaSalle, Sergeants Charles Perry, John Bodnar, Frederick Brunner, and Jack Risler, Captain Francis Coolidge of the Army Air Forces, and Joseph Arcelin, a free French officer carrying forged papers that identified him as an American Marine. Each man carried an M1 carbine and a 0.45 caliber pistol. Each man carried a flask of cognac, $1,000 in French francs, and a pack of Lucky Strikes. Major Ortiz carried a suitcase containing 1 million francs for the resistance. They jumped in daylight near the town of Les Saisies in the Haute-Savoie. Along with the team, 864 containers of weapons, ammunition, explosives, and supplies were dropped for the French WWII battalion operating in the region. The mission began with death. Sergeant Charles Perry was 22 years old. He was from Needham, Massachusetts, the 4th of 6 children. His father worked in a shoe factory. Perry had enlisted in the Marine Corps in October of 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor. He had volunteered for parachute training after learning that his brother had been wounded while serving as a paratrooper. On August 1, 1944, Perry's steel static line snapped 6 inches from the drogue. His parachute did not deploy. At the altitude they were jumping, there was no time for a reserve. Sergeant Charles Perry hit the drop zone at terminal velocity. His teammates buried him with full military honors on the field where he fell. The surviving members of the team collected the supply containers, linked up with the maquis, and began their work. For 2 weeks, they trained resistance fighters in the use of the new weapons. They taught them how to conduct ambushes. They taught them how to harass retreating German forces. They conducted reconnaissance. They mapped positions. They planned operations. The damage they inflicted was so disproportionate to their numbers that German intelligence reached a conclusion that would later become one of the most footnotes in the history of World War II. Based on the volume of attacks, the sophistication of the ambushes, and the geographic spread of the operations, German analysts concluded that an Allied battalion had been inserted into the Haute-Savoie to support the resistance. Not a team, a battalion, hundreds of men. That was the only explanation that fit the data. The data was wrong. There were 6 Marines and 1 soldier. Among the Marines who had jumped with Ortiz, one of them was a sergeant named John Bodnar. He was quiet. The historical record tells us almost nothing about his life before the war. We do not know where he grew up. We do not know why he joined the Marines. We do not know what he thought about when he was not fighting. What we know is that he was there, that he jumped into France, that he fought, and that when the moment came that defined the entire operation, he said one sentence that the Marine Corps has preserved in its archives ever since. That moment came on August 16th. The team was moving through the village of Centron, a small cluster of houses and a church in the Alpine Valley, when they encountered a German convoy on the national highway. 10 to 12 heavy trucks, carrying several hundred troops from the 157th Alpine Reserve Division, headed for the garrison at Bourg Saint-Maurice. The surprise was mutual. The trucks screeched to a halt. Soldiers tumbled out and began firing. The team scattered. In the confusion, they split into 2 groups. Coolidge, Arcelin, and Brunner took the southeast side of the village. Ortiz found himself with Risler and Bodnar in the southwest. The fighting moved from house to house, 3 Marines with carbines and pistols against several hundred German soldiers with rifles, machine guns, and the full weight of a military convoy behind them. The Germans advanced. They surrounded the village. They tightened the perimeter. Ortiz and his 2 men kept firing. They moved from window to window, doorway to doorway, creating the impression of a larger force. The Germans, already primed by 2 weeks of intelligence reports about a phantom Allied battalion, responded to the volume of fire with the caution of men who believed they were engaging a fortified position. And then the villagers came to Ortiz. They were terrified, not of the fighting, of what would come after. 2 weeks earlier, the Germans had shelled the town of Montgirod, where resistance fighters had been operating. The reprisal had been total. The town was destroyed. In other villages across the Haute-Savoie, the pattern had been the same. If the Germans believed a town had harbored the Maquis, the town burned. If the Germans believed civilians had aided Allied soldiers, the civilians died. Centron was next. The villagers knew it. They begged the Americans to stop fighting. Ortiz later wrote in his after-action report that since the activities of Mission Union and its previous work were well known to the Gestapo, there was no reason to hope they would be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. For him personally, the decision to surrender was not too difficult. He had been involved in dangerous activities for many years and was mentally prepared for his number to turn up. He turned to Bodnar. He explained the situation. He explained what he intended to do. Bodnar looked him in the eye. "Major, we are Marines. What you think is right goes for me too." 1 sentence, 9 words. And in those 9 words, something that no training manual could produce and no military analyst could quantify. Not obedience. Obedience is what happens when a subordinate follows an order because the alternative is punishment. This was something else. This was a man who understood exactly what was about to happen to him. A man who knew he was about to walk into captivity from which he might never return, and who chose to do it anyway because the man next to him believed it was the right thing to do. Ortiz told his men to escape while there was still a chance. They refused. He stepped out from behind the wall. He walked into the open. German machine gun fire kicked up dirt around his feet. He kept walking. He called out in German, in French, in English. He said he wished to negotiate. An old French woman ran out from one of the houses and tried to shield him with her body. He gently moved her aside. The firing stopped. Ortiz walked to the German lines and spoke with Major Kolb, the battalion commander. He offered to surrender his entire garrison if Kolb would give his word that the townspeople would not be harmed. Kolb, believing he was accepting the surrender of a company-sized unit, agreed. Ortiz walked back. He collected Risler and Bodnar. Arslan, who according to some accounts was wearing the uniform of the dead Sergeant Perry, was captured separately. Coolidge and Brunner managed to escape. 3 men walked out to surrender. Kolb stared at them. He looked behind them. He sent soldiers into the houses, into the church, into the basements. There was no one else. Major Stephen White, a Marine Corps intelligence officer, who later served as liaison to the 60th anniversary commemoration of Operation Union, described the moment in terms that have become part of Marine Corps institutional memory. The German officer was in disbelief. He did not believe that only 4 Marines had held off his forces for this long. He insisted that Major Ortiz turn over the rest of his team members. Ortiz told him there were no other team members. This was it. This was the entire force. The German major stood in a village in the French Alps, surrounded by 200 of his own soldiers, and tried to comprehend how 4 men with carbines and pistols had created the impression of a battalion. He could not. Henderson Field, Tarawa, and now a village in the Alps. 3 times the numbers said one thing, and reality said another. A force too small to succeed succeeding, a defense too strong to break breaking, and in each case, the men on the losing side of the equation, staring at the result, and reaching for an explanation that was not there. The Marines at Centron did not fight the way Barcelona fought at Guadalcanal. They did not advance under fire the way the nameless corporals and privates advanced at Tarawa. They surrendered. They laid down their weapons and walked into captivity. But the principle was the same. At Guadalcanal, the decision was to attack when every rational calculation said retreat. At Tarawa, the decision was to advance when every rational calculation said stop. At Centron, the decision was to surrender when every rational calculations said fight to the last bullet. Because the lives of French civilians mattered more than the reputation of American Marines. 3 different decisions, 3 different outcomes, and every single one of them made by men who had already settled the question that paralysis is built on. Men who were not calculating whether they would survive. Men who had moved past that calculation into a space where the only question left was what is the right thing to do, and then did it. The Germans had a model for soldiers who fought to the death. That was the SS. They had a model for soldiers who surrendered wisely. That was the British. They had a model for soldiers who obeyed without question. That was the Soviets. They did not have a model for soldiers who chose freely, who attacked when they should have defended, who advanced when they should have stopped, who surrendered when they should have fought, who made every decision as if the fear of death had been removed from the equation entirely, leaving only the raw calculation of what the situation required. Ortiz and his men were taken to Chambéry, and there, the Marine major did something so audacious that the German general who received him could not decide whether to laugh or have him shot. Ortiz requested a meeting with General Karl Pflaum, commanding officer of the 157th Alpine Reserve Division. The request was granted. The captured American major, a prisoner of war who by all rights should have been grateful to still be breathing, walked into Pflaum's office and demanded that the 157th Division surrender to Mission Union 2. General Pflaum told him to get out of his office before he had him executed. The surrender did not take place, but the story spread through the German ranks like a virus. A captured American Marine, outnumbered, outgunned, imprisoned, had walked into a German general's office and demanded the general surrender to him. The men of the 157th Division did not know what to make of it. It did not fit any model they possessed. This was becoming a pattern. Iwo Jima, February 8, 1945. 5,000 miles from the French Alps, 800 miles south of Tokyo. A volcanic island less than 5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, shaped like a pork chop, covered in black sand that swallowed men's boots to the ankle and smelled faintly of sulfur. At its southern tip, a dead volcano called Mount Suribachi rose 550 feet above the beach, like a watchtower built by the earth itself. Beneath the surface of that island, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent the better part of a year building something that had no precedent in the history of warfare. He had studied Guadalcanal. He had studied Tarawa. He had studied every engagement where Japanese forces had attempted to stop the Marines. And he had identified, with the cold precision of a man who understood he was designing his own tomb, exactly where his predecessors had gone wrong. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese had tried to retake the airfield with massed infantry assaults. The Marines had broken them on the wire. Lesson: do not attack the Marines head-on. They fight better when they can see you coming. At Tarawa, the Japanese had built surface fortifications. The Marines had taken catastrophic casualties crossing the reef, but they had reached the beach, and once they were on the beach, they had ground through the bunkers one by one. Lesson: do not build your defense where naval guns can reach it. Do not rely on the beach to stop them. Nothing stops them on the beach. Kuribayashi absorbed these lessons, and then he did something that no Japanese commander before him had done. He abandoned the beach entirely. He ordered his engineers to dig, not trenches, not bunkers, tunnels, miles of tunnels, 11 miles of interconnected underground passages cut into the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, chambers large enough to hold hundreds of men, ventilation shafts, multiple entrances and exits for each position, so that a gun emplacement that was destroyed could be reoccupied through a different tunnel within minutes. The entire island became a fortress that existed below the surface, invisible from the air, unreachable by naval bombardment, immune to everything except a man with a rifle and a flamethrower standing directly in front of the opening. Kuribayashi placed his 21,000 defenders inside this underground network and gave them a simple order: do not conduct banzai charges. Do not waste lives in futile attacks. Stay underground. Wait for the Americans to land. Let them come ashore. Let them think the bombardment has worked. And then, when they are on the beach, in the open, with nowhere to hide, open fire from positions they cannot see and kill as many of them as possible before you die. Because Kuribayashi knew his men would die, all of them. He had written to his wife before the battle and told her he would not be coming home. He did not say this with self-pity. He said it as a statement of fact, the way a man might note that it would rain tomorrow. The question was not whether the garrison would be destroyed. The question was how many Americans it would take with it. Kuribayashi's calculation was not irrational. It was based on a clear strategic logic. If the cost of taking Iwo Jima was high enough, if the casualty reports that reached Washington were horrifying enough, then perhaps the American government would reconsider the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Perhaps the politicians would seek a negotiated peace rather than pay the price of total conquest. Every dead Marine on Iwo Jima was an argument for negotiation. This logic had worked in the European theater. High casualties in Italy had slowed Allied momentum. High casualties in the Ardennes had produced genuine anxiety in Washington. Public opinion was a weapon, and Kuribayashi intended to use it. What he did not have in his calculation was the specific composition of the men climbing into the landing craft on the morning of February 19th. Among those men was Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone. He was 28 years old. He had a Medal of Honor. He had a wife. Her name was Lena, a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. They had married 6 months earlier, in July of 1944, at a ceremony in Oceanside, California, near Camp Pendleton. He had been given everything a grateful nation gives its heroes: the medal, the fame, the war bond tour, the handshakes and the speeches and the flashbulbs, and the certainty that he would never have to hear a machine gun again unless he wanted to. He did not want the speeches. He did not want the flashbulbs. He told a friend that he felt like a museum piece. like something people came to look at rather than something that had a purpose. He requested assignment to a combat unit. The request was granted. He was assigned to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He was given a machine gun section. He was given men who looked at him the way young men look at legends, and he did his best to turn them into Marines who would not need a legend to tell them what to do. At 0900 on February 19th, the first wave hit Red Beach. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. The island was silent. The Marines came ashore, struggled through the black volcanic sand that gave way under their feet like loose gravel on a hillside, and moved inland. Some of them thought the bombardment had worked. Some of them thought the island was empty. Kuribayashi was watching from his command post deep inside the tunnel network. He waited until the beach was full of men, until the landing craft were stacked up at the waterline, until there was no room to maneuver, no space to take cover, no direction to go, except forward into ground he had spent a year preparing. Then he gave the order. The island erupted. Every hidden gun position opened fire simultaneously. Mortars, artillery, machine guns, all firing from positions the Marines could not see, into a beach packed with men who had nowhere to hide. The black sand offered no protection. There were no trees, no rocks, no folds in the terrain large enough to shelter a human body, just flat, open, volcanic ash, and fire coming from everywhere. John Basilone landed in the middle of it. What he did in the next hours is recorded in his Navy Cross citation, awarded posthumously. The citation describes him moving his machine gun section off the beach under devastating fire. It describes him leading an attack on a Japanese blockhouse that was pinning down his company. It describes him working his way around the position and attacking it from the flank, enabling his men to advance. The citation does not describe what it felt like. It does not describe the noise, which survivors said was so constant and so loud that it stopped being noise and became a physical pressure, like being underwater. It does not describe that, which was so fine and so volcanic that weapons jammed within minutes and had to be cleared by hand, while bullets struck the ground around the man doing the clearing. It does not describe the smell, which was sulfur and blood and burning metal, and something else that men who were there said they could still smell 30 years later. Basilone got his men off the beach. He got them past the first line of defenses. He reached the edge of Airfield No. 1, the first of 3 Japanese airstrips on the island, and somewhere near that airfield, in the smoke and the chaos and the black sand, the war caught up with him. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone was killed on February 19, 1945, the same day he landed. He was 28 years old. Most accounts say a Japanese mortar round killed him, and 4 members of his platoon. The author Hugh Ambrose, researching for the HBO miniseries The Pacific, concluded it was small arms fire that struck him in the neck, and the exact manner of his death remains uncertain. What is not uncertain is the fact he had survived Guadalcanal. He had survived the war bond tour. He had not survived the first day on Iwo Jima. He was not the only one. On that first day alone, the Marines suffered 2,400 casualties. More than 500 were killed before sunset. The beach was so covered with wounded men that the medical stations ran out of space and began treating men in the surf. And the Marines kept landing, wave after wave after wave. Men who could see the beach from the landing craft, who could see the bodies in the sand and the burning vehicles, and the tracers cutting the air in every direction, climbed over the side and went anyway. 4 days later, on February 23rd, a patrol from the 28th Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. They carried a flag. They found a length of pipe. They raised the flag on top of the mountain. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal took a photograph of a second larger flag being raised later that same day. The photograph became the most reproduced image in the history of American photography. It became a postage stamp. It became a monument in bronze that stands today outside Arlington National Cemetery. It became for most Americans the image of Iwo Jima. But the flag went up on February 23rd. The island was not declared secure until March 26th, 31 days. 31 days between the photograph and the end. 31 days that no postage stamp commemorates and no bronze monument depicts. 31 days of fighting in tunnels and caves and pillboxes that had to be taken one at a time. Each one a small battle, each one producing casualties that accumulated with the relentless patience of water wearing down stone. In those 31 days after the flag, 6,200 more Marines were wounded. Another 1,200 were killed. The flag is the symbol. The 31 days after the flag are the reality. When the island was finally secured, the arithmetic was complete. 26,000 Marine casualties. 6,821 dead. Across 36 days, on 5 square miles of volcanic rock, they took the island. Kuribayashi's plan had worked exactly as designed. The tunnels held, the hidden positions fired. The casualties were staggering. Every element of his defensive strategy performed precisely as he had calculated. And it did not matter, because the variable he had failed to account for, the variable that no mathematical model could capture, was the willingness of the men on the beach to absorb those casualties and continue functioning, not as individuals performing acts of heroism, as a system, as an institution that had been designed, from the ground up, to operate in exactly these conditions. Kuribayashi died on Iwo Jima. The exact circumstances of his death are uncertain. Some accounts say he led a final attack on March 26th. Some say he took his own life in his command bunker. His body was never positively identified. He had told his officers not to let the enemy find his remains. He left behind letters to his wife and children that are among the most human documents to emerge from the Pacific War. Letters about missing his family, about his daughter's schoolwork, about the garden at their home. Letters written by a man who knew exactly what was coming and chose to face it with a clarity that contained no illusion and no self-deception. He was not a monster. He was a professional soldier serving a government that had made catastrophic decisions, and he did his duty with an intelligence and a resolve that the Marines who fought against him came to respect. He also failed, not because his plan was flawed, because the men he was trying to stop could not be stopped. In the late 1940s, as the wartime alliances dissolved and the Cold War began reshaping the world, the United States military undertook an extraordinary project. It recruited hundreds of former German officers, many of them generals and senior staff officers, and asked them to write detailed analyses of the war they had just lost. The project was called the Foreign Military Studies Program. It operated under the direction of the United States Army Historical Division, and it produced thousands of pages of documents in which men who had commanded German armies sat in offices provided by their former enemies and wrote, with varying degrees of honesty, about what they had seen and what they had learned. These documents are not scripture. They must be read with care and with an awareness of the context in which they were produced. The German officers who wrote them were not disinterested scholars. They were men with careers to rebuild and reputations to salvage. Some of them were trying to avoid prosecution for war crimes. Many of them had a strong incentive to tell Americans what the Americans wanted to hear. Fritz Bayerlein, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa and later commanded the Panzer Lehr Division in Normandy and the Ardennes, was one of the most prolific contributors to the program. He cooperated so enthusiastically with American historians that other German officers accused him of disloyalty. His manuscripts have been criticized by later historians as being intentionally flattering to his captors. This matters. It matters because German generals praised American military effectiveness in these documents. Some of that praise may have been strategic rather than sincere. But the documents are not the only source, and the pattern they describe is not a pattern that flattery alone can explain. Bayerlein fought the American army in North Africa, in France, and in Belgium. He never fought the Marines. He never served in the Pacific. What he wrote about American combat effectiveness was based entirely on his experience with army formations, and what he noted with a frankness that reads as genuine, even through the filter of his circumstances, was that the aggressive quality of American junior leadership was surprising, given the American civilian tradition from which those leaders came. He wrote that he did not have a satisfying explanation for it. This is a small observation, a footnote in a much larger analysis, but it points towards something that appears again and again in the post-war literature, from sources that had no coordination with each other and no shared incentive to invent the same story. The Americans fought in a way that German models could not predict. Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as a staff officer with multiple German commands and later wrote the influential military memoir Panzer Battles, published in 1956, addressed the same phenomenon from a different angle. His book focused on the European theater. It did not discuss the Marines or the Pacific War directly, but it described a pattern of American tactical behavior that echoed what Pacific analysts had been writing about for years. American units making choices that German models predicted would fail, the choices succeeding, the models being revised, the Americans making different choices, those also succeeding. Mellenthin concluded that the problem was not the models. The problem was that the Americans did not fight according to any model the Germans possessed. The Pacific reports, collected through Japanese intelligence channels and analyzed by German staff officers throughout the war, told the same story in more extreme terms. The Marines were the most concentrated expression of the quality that confused the Germans about American soldiers in general. The willingness to act independently, the willingness to attack, the willingness to absorb losses that should have produced paralysis and instead produced acceleration. The Germans had a model for every kind of soldier they had encountered in 6 years of war across 3 continents. Disciplined soldiers, fanatical soldiers, expendable soldiers, cautious soldiers, reckless soldiers. They did not have a model for soldiers who were none of these things and all of them at once. Soldiers who were disciplined enough to hold a position and aggressive enough to leave it, cautious enough to plan, and reckless enough to abandon the plan when the plan stopped working. Expendable, in the sense that they accepted the possibility of death, and invaluable in the sense that each individual man could function as his own commanding officer when the real commanding officer was gone. The closest the German analytical tradition came to naming this quality was a phrase used in one of the post-war intelligence summaries. The phrase described the Marine Corps as the only force in the war that consistently performed better as conditions worsened. The analyst noted that this was inverse to all standard military model, that no framework existed for it, that there was only the data. That phrase, quiet and clinical, and buried in a document that most people will never read, is perhaps the most honest epitaph for everything the Marines did between 1942 and 1945. All the models said one thing, the data said another, and the data was written in blood on beaches, and in jungles, and in volcanic ash, by men who had been built for exactly this purpose. Peter Ortiz spent the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp called Marlag Millag Nord, near the village of Westertimk outside Bremen. He was imprisoned with Bodnar, Risler, and Arsilan. He attempted to escape multiple times. In April of 1945, as the Allied armies closed in on Germany from every direction, the camp commandant ordered the prisoners to prepare to march. The column left in haste. RAF Spitfires attacked the retreating Germans from the air. In the chaos, Ortiz escaped with 2 Americans and 1 British prisoner. They spent 10 days hiding in the woods, moving at night, stumbling into German positions in the darkness and slipping away. They had almost no food. By the 7th night, they had circled back near the camp. Ortiz made a reconnaissance view. The Guardsners appeared to have taken virtual control of the compound. On the 10th day, starving and exhausted, the 4 escapees walked back into the camp. No one stopped them. The remaining prisoners gave them a rousing welcome. 2 days later, on April 29th, 1945, the British 7th Guards Armoured Division reached Westertimke. Bagpipes, tanks, liberation. Ortiz presented himself to a British naval officer attached to the Royal Marines. He said he wanted to join their unit in order to bag a few more Germans before hunting season closed. The offer was appreciated. It was declined. The prisoners were loaded onto trucks and transported to the rear. Peter Ortiz received his second Navy Cross for Operation Union II. Risler, Bodnar, and LaSalle received the Silver Star. Ortiz returned to the United States. He was offered a chance to fight in the Pacific, but Japan surrendered in August before he could deploy. He went back to Hollywood. He became an actor. He appeared in several films, including Rio Grande with John Wayne, directed by John Ford. At least 2 Hollywood movies were loosely based on his wartime exploits. 13 Rue Madeline in 1947, Operation Secret in 1952. In 1954, at the age of 41, he volunteered to return to active duty as a Marine observer in Indochina. The Marine Corps declined his request. Current military policies, they wrote, would not permit the assignment requested. He retired as a colonel. He died on May 16, 1988, at the age of 74. On August 1, 1992, the people of Centron held a ceremony in their village. 48 years after the day, a tall American Marine had walked through machine gun fire to save their families. They had not forgotten. The village remembered the man who had traded his own freedom for theirs, and they honored him in the place where it happened, in the shadow of the Alps, in the same streets where the bullets had fallen. How do you build men who perform better as conditions worsen? The answer was never a secret. It was never classified. It was written into Marine Corps training doctrine in language Ayot did not read, which did not believe that men became hard in battle. They believed men needed to be made hard before battle, so that battle itself was a familiar environment rather than a shock. The physical brutality of boot camp at Paris Island and San Diego was not designed to build strong bodies, although it did that. It was designed to do something more specific and more important. It was designed to take a civilian man and push him systematically, repeatedly, to the edge of what he believed he could endure, and then push him past that edge, and then show him that the edge was not where he thought it was, that he had more in him than he knew, that the breaking point he feared was not a wall but a line drawn in chalk that his own feet could smudge. The purpose was not to eliminate fear. Fear is a biological reality. It cannot be trained out of a man any more than hunger or thirst can be trained out of him. The purpose was to change the relationship between the man and his fear, to make him familiar with the feeling of being at his limit, so that when combat pushed him there, he recognized where he was. He had been there before, in training, in the long marches, in the exercises that went on hours past the point where his body said, "Stop." He had been to the edge, and he had not broken. That knowledge, that private internal knowledge, that he had already survived his own worst moment, was the foundation on which everything else was built. The aggression, the initiative, the willingness to decide alone in the dark, the willingness to advance when the man next to him was dead, and the officer behind him was dead, and the plan was dead, and the only thing still alive was the question of what to do next. Colonel Merritt Edson, who had commanded Marines at Bloody Ridge on Guadalcanal, and earned the Medal of Honor for holding a position through a night that veterans described as the longest of their lives, was asked after the war what he believed was the single most important factor in Marine battlefield performance. He said, "You men have done a great job, and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night. One more night." That was the promise Edson made, and the promise his Marines kept. Not win the war, not conquer the island, just one more night, and then another, until the nights added up and the enemy was gone, and the men who had held were still standing. It was not superhuman. That is the point. It was not genetic or mystical or the product of some uniquely American quality that other nations lacked. It was built deliberately, systematically, by men who understood exactly what they were building and why. The Marines decided, before the war started, what kind of men they needed, and then they made them. And on island after island, in the dark and in the heat, in the black sand of Iwo Jima and the coral of Tarawa and the jungle of Guadalcanal, and in a small village in the French Alps, where 3 men walked out to face 200, those men met the enemy. And the enemy wrote down what they saw. And what they wrote down, stripped of context, stripped of patriotism, stripped of mythology, stripped of everything except the raw data of combat, was always the same thing. We were not ready for this. We had been ready for the war. We had planned for the war. We had trained for the war. We had built fortifications and dug tunnels and stockpiled ammunition and studied maps and done everything that professional soldiers do to prepare for what is coming. And none of it was enough. Because what was not what we expected. What came was not an army. Not in the sense that we understood the word. What came was an institution that had solved a problem we did not know could be solved. The problem of making ordinary men function in extraordinary conditions. The problem of taking fear, the universal constant of combat, the thing that stops every soldier eventually, and turning it from a wall into a door. The Marines did not eliminate fear, they walked through it. They walked through it so many times in training that walking through it became the habit, and the habit became the instinct, and the instinct became the thing that German officers spent years trying to name and never quite could. They were not brave in the way that word is usually meant. Bravery implies a choice made in the moment, a decision to act despite fear. What the Marines had was something that preceded the moment, something that had been settled long before the first shot was fired, a question answered in advance, so that when the shooting started, the answer was already there, already built into the nervous system, already as automatic as breathing. The question was, what do I do when everything goes wrong? And the answer, trained into them until it was part of who they were, was simple: move forward. In the end, the most honest description of the Marines came not from the official reports or the post-war analyses or the memoirs of generals who had spent their careers studying the problem. It came from the accumulated weight of enemy testimony, from the fragments and annotations and margin notes and interrogation transcripts that German and Japanese officers produced across 3 years of war. All of it, taken together, said the same thing in different words. The prisoners on Guadalcanal, who described Americans who hunted at night. The analysts in Berlin, who could not make the numbers work. The staff officers on Iwo Jima, who watched their carefully designed defenses fail against men who would not stop. The German major in a village in the French Alps who stared at 3 men and asked where the rest of them were. They all arrived at the same place. These men had not decided they were already dead. That would have been despair. That would have been the resignation of men who had given up. These men had decided that being dead was acceptable. And there is a difference, a vast difference, a difference that contains the whole of what the Marine Corps was and what it built, and why the enemy could never find a model that explained it. The man who has decided he is already dead has surrendered. He fights without purpose, because he believes the outcome is fixed. The man who has decided that death is acceptable has freed himself. He fights with absolute clarity, because the thing that clouds every other soldier's judgment, the weight of survival as the primary objective, has been removed. He is free to see the situation as it actually is. Free to make the decision the situation actually requires. Free to attack, or defend, or advance, or retreat, or surrender, not based on what keeps him alive, but based on what the mission demands. These were free men. That is what made them dangerous. And every enemy who faced them, on every island, on every beach, in every jungle and every cave and every village, wrote the same confession in the same stunned language of men, confronting something they had not been trained to face. We had been ready for the war. We had not been ready for them.